Hi, this is Mark Irwin, and this is a brief introduction to the KAP 140 Autopilot, the KAP 140. And today we're using it in conjunction with the G1000. To begin with, this is the Autopilot right here in its off state. It's not turned on, but even in the off state, it is displaying an altitude here, which you can set using these concentric knobs right over here. The outer knob controls the thousands, so you can rotate the thousands, or you can rotate the hundreds using the inner knob. Okay, so whether the Autopilot is on or off, you can set the altitude in that window with that display. Now, even in the off state, when you set an altitude in there, it will give you what we term an altitude alert. Currently I have it set for, I'm going to set it for 3,700, or let's say, I'll leave it at 4,000. Now when we get to within 1,000 feet of our target altitude, this simulator won't do it, but you'll get an audible alert, right? But you'll also see a display here, alert, and there'll be a beeping noise that you'll hear to indicate that you're coming within 1,000 feet of your set target altitude. So even in the off condition, the Autopilot will always provide you with an altitude alert so long as you set your target altitude in that window. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to just take you through the buttons that are on the Autopilot. Okay. The far left button here is the on-off button. It says AP on it. AP for on-off. The next button is heading. It says HDG, heading. The next button says Nav, N-A-V. The next button, APR, which stands for approach. The next button over is REV for reverse course. These two buttons right here, APR and reverse, REV, are only used in IFR flying. You won't be using those in VFR flying. And this last button here is ALT. Okay, and that last alert here, you may have heard, you get another alert when you come within 300 feet of your set target altitude. But as it is right now, I'm still climbing and the Autopilot isn't on, so the plane would continue to fly. You know, I can continue to hand fly it with no difficulty with the Autopilot off. Remember this, one of the cardinal rules about using Autopilot is either you're flying or the Autopilot is flying. Neither, not both at the same time. If the Autopilot starts doing something that you don't like or are confused about, immediately disconnect the Autopilot and then continue hand flying. But don't try to override the Autopilot when it is on, because it will fight you back, and I guarantee you the Autopilot will always win. So we have, again, for VFR purposes, 4 buttons to note on this bottom row. AP for on-off, heading mode, HDG, that's heading mode, we'll talk about that in a minute, nav mode, NAV, and then ALT, standing for altitude. Over here in the white box here, we have an up button and a down button, and we'll talk about the use of those in a few minutes. Finally, in the upper right corner, we have ARM button, ARM, and baro. Now, I might as well talk about the baro right now, because when you first start the airplane, one of the things your checklist is going to have you do, of course, is set the current altimeter setting into your altimeter based on what you hear on the ATIS or the local ASOS, the 1-minute weather if it's an uncontrolled airport. In addition to setting it there on your G1000, you'll also need to set it into the Autopilot as a second setting. So if today the baro is 29 or 9 or 2, we press the barrel button, and if we needed to adjust it, we'd use the outer and inner knobs over here. The outer knobs controlling well, let's see, how does that work? In this simulator, okay, that controls the tenths, and then the inner knob controls the hundredths. Okay, so we're going to set it to the right. We need for the barometric pressure setting in the autopilot to agree with what we have on our altimeter, otherwise they'll be out of sync. Okay, so we've talked about the buttons across the bottom and all across going up, down buttons, and arm and baro, and how to use the baro button to set the barometer to agree with the altimeter. Now we're going to get ready to turn on the autopilot, and I would highly recommend that until you get more familiar with the autopilot, that you wait until you're in reasonably level flight before turning it on. And that's because when you turn on the autopilot using the AP button, it's going to capture whatever was happening at the moment you turned it on in terms of whether or not you're on a climb or descent or in level flight. And as long as you're in a level flight or a slight climb or descent, it's very easy to manage from this point forward. But what you want to avoid certainly is avoid being in a steep climb, and while at the same time turning on the autopilot. That invites a series of problems that you just don't want to encounter. So again, just before you turn on the autopilot, just level the plane out, get it flying at a reasonably level altitude, as I'm doing right here, and I'm going to get it trimmed more or less here. If I'm in a slight climb or descent at the moment I turn on the autopilot, that's not going to matter. Alright, so here we go. I'm going to turn on the autopilot, and it goes into what's called roll pitch mode. And what it will do is the roll mode, the ROL, simply means that it's going to work on keeping the wings reasonably level. Okay, it's not, if you're in a bank, if you're in a slight bank, it will maintain that bank, but if you're in a larger bank, it will bring you back to level. At the same time, it will capture and maintain whatever the plane was doing at the very moment you turned on the autopilot. So in this case, we must have been in a 200 foot per minute climb, and so we are continuing to be in a climb. Much of the time, you'll want to use the autopilot to simply follow the heading bug that you have set, the heading as set by the heading bug. So we're going to do that right now. I'm going to center the heading bug. That's always a good practice, is before you turn on the heading mode on the autopilot, first center the heading bug, and I'm going to push the heading button, HDG. And you see it displayed in the upper portion of the screen here. HDG, now meaning that we are in heading mode. Now, as it is, we're still climbing. The fact that I have 4,000 set into the autopilot at this point is not relevant. It has no control over what the plane is doing. But if I were to, at this point, press ALT, think of ALT as an altitude lock. Okay? Think of ALT as an altitude lock. And again, it has nothing to do with this altitude right here, but it freezes. When you press that button, it just locks the altitude over whatever it was at the moment you push that altitude. So if you're just looking for a quick and dirty way to get the autopilot turned on, working, set it to heading, center your heading bug, press heading button, and press the Alt button, and you'll level right out, and then you can work from there. Now I'm going to avoid some terrain that's coming up here, I'm going to rotate the heading bug about 180 degrees, and you'll see that the autopilot now is going to command the plane to follow the heading bug while maintaining a constant altitude, because again, we've locked in the altitude. Currently the altitude's reading about 5,340 feet. Now I'm going to, in the meantime, I'm going to set an altitude in here. I'm going to set in 4,500 feet, and right now it won't in any way affect what the altitude lock is doing right now. By entering any sort of altitude in here, it doesn't change. The altitude that the plane's at. I'm going to set in 4,500 using these knobs right here. And you saw when I did that, on the second row here, it now says Altitude Arm, ALT Arm. And that's important. You always want to see that in that second row. And if it is not displaying there, you want to press the arm button over here to make sure that shows up. Okay, so whether you have to do it manually by pressing the arm button, or sometimes by simply rotating the knobs, that will cause the armed mode to come up for the altitude. But in either case, always make sure that if you're intending on capturing an altitude either in a climb or descent, that you arm that altitude and make sure and verify that it's displayed as it is here. Again, nothing has happened yet because we haven't unlocked the altitude from what it is right now, but we're going to do that now. So I'm going to unlock the altitude, and when I do that, nothing happens because nothing will happen until I hit the up or down button. So I'm going to start hitting the down button. Come on. Hang on. Okay, down. And you'll see that with every sequential push on the button, it will give me, when you see a minus sign there, it indicates a minus, in this case, a minus 300. Now it's minus 400 feet per minute descent. And now we've got, now if you look up here at the altitude, we've started to go down. Now because I have the altitude armed at 4,500, turn that off. Because I have the, excuse me, because I have the altitude armed at 4,500, it will bring me down at the rate I specified, 400 feet per minute, and will continue to descend until it reaches 4,500, at which point, you can watch for this altitude then, once it gets to 4,500, the altitude armed indicator will disappear, and that VS will then turn to ALT, indicating that again, once again, the altitude has been locked in at that altitude. So here we go, we're at about 300 feet to go. We should get an alert here. There it is. You know, and you'll normally get an audible alert too when you're within 300 feet of your altitude. First 1,000, then 300. Okay, watch what happened. All right. Actually, that was at 200. This G1000 must be programmed for 200 feet. Okay, it's getting your attention here. We're getting close to our capture altitude. Now one thing, the autopilot does not control throttle. So, you know, normally you reduce your power somewhat to control airspeed on descent. But then now as it captures, watch what happens here. There it is. It went to ALT, and now we're locked in at 4,500. But now if I don't add the power back in, the airspeed is going to continue to go down. So I need to add the power back in that I had subtracted during the descent in order to restore that airspeed or maintain the airspeed. Okay, so now at this point, say we want to climb back up to 5,500 using the autopilot. What would we do? First step is we want to set the altitude that we'd like to climb or descend to. In this case, I want to climb to 5,000 feet. So I'm going to set in 5,000 feet using these knobs. And you see by doing that, automatically the altitude armed indicator showed up. But again, we're not climbing because I haven't yet commanded a climb to that altitude. I'm going to command that climb by, again, unlocking the altitude to get the vertical speed mode, and then I'm going to hit up about 500 feet per minute. Generally, in the Cessna 172, 500 feet per minute climb is what you pretty much want. Nothing much higher than that, because the plane will struggle. And now you've seen we've gone into a climb. And once again, once we reach that altitude, the VS, well, the altitude arm will disappear and the VS will change to ALT, indicating that it has captured. Okay, so this is on heading mode, and I can, while I'm climbing to intercept that altitude, I could be given, I could turn to a given heading. I'm going to turn to 180 roughly while I'm climbing. So the altitude cap, the climb and the banking is all, it's handled independently. You don't affect one by doing the other. Okay, let's watch for the altitude to capture. Now you always want to climb at full power in those Cessna 172. Okay, good. And now we've captured. Now let's just say now that we've checked in with NorCal. The next, we've got a handoff to NorCal approach, and as they always do, they'll say, I checked in 254 kilos at 5,000 feet. Now, so Roger, Oakland altimeter is 29907. Okay, so I would set 29907 on my G1000. Okay, let's see right here, 29907, and I'm going to have to set it on the autopilot also. So hitting Barrow 29907. They work independently, and I see in the simulator here they kind of talk to one another. They don't in the airplane. You have to set them independently, but once you set that new altitude in the autopilot, it will automatically correct, because once you change the altimeter setting, the altitude display is going to change, and when it does, the autopilot will self-correct and bring the plane back to the correct altitude that you have commanded. All right. So they've talked about the heading mode, the altitude button, how that works, cycling between altitude lock and vertical speed mode through the use of the ALT button. The up-down buttons we use to command a climb or descent in hundreds of feet when we're in the VS mode. If you're in the ALT mode, it has, the buttons have no function. Okay, so if you're trying to push the up-down buttons and nothing's happening, it's probably because you're still in ALT. You have to unlock that with the ALT button to get to VS. Okay, let me get back to our altitude. And by the way, like right here, if I press the Barrow button to bring up the Barrow, it's going to flash, and then if I don't set it, it reverts back to the altitude. So you don't have to press the buttons to get that back. Okay, so the last thing we want to talk about is or a couple things. Now, I'm in heading mode. Now let's just say that instead, when I activate the autopilot, instead of following a heading bug, I want to follow a GPS course, for example, or let's just say a VOR frequency. Okay, when I'm in heading mode, nothing I'm going to enter in a I'm going to put in up here, you can't see it on screen, but I'm dialing in the Woodside VOR, and I'm going to change my CDI button to Nav 1, and I'm going to press the course needle to center it, and now I'm going to go on to Nav mode on the autopilot, and you'll see then, instead of following the heading bug now, it knows it wants to, the autopilot will work on keeping the navigation needle center that I've set in there, whether it's VOR, a VOR radial that I've dialed in, or if it's a GPS course segment, which I be following if I changed over to a magenta needle. Now you see that in making the turn already, then we're getting somewhat off the radial that I have set in there, but the autopilot is smart enough that it will come back and it will recapture that and center it. you see that when I press the nav button, instead of, the HDG here changed to nav mode. Now this, okay, all right, so kind of overshooting a little bit. We're quite close. I think right now we're about 30 miles from the VOR, looks like. All right. See, my fuel quantity is going low. I'm going to add some fuel here. There we go. Get rid of that flash. Okay. All right. So now you see that the autopilot is now tracking the VOR needle. In this case, the VOR radial. Currently, we have, since we're going to the VOR. On our course, needle is set to 297, so we've talked about this before. If we're going to the VOR, it means that we're tracking actually the reciprocal of that, the 117 radial. Okay. Now at any given point in time, if I wanted to, I could switch over to heading mode. Like once it gets a nice beat, gets locked in on this course needle, I could then center my heading bug, bring it up there, and then switch over to heading mode, and there shouldn't be much of a change at all because the heading bug's right there. So I could switch back and forth, nav mode, and as long as I'm reasonably close to the navigation signal, it will pick it right up. Now I'm going to center heading mode, and I'm going to center heading bug, go on heading mode, and let's just say now that instead of tracking this radial, I'm going to turn the course arrow to something like this, far enough away that it's unlikely that if you're far enough off the course signal, the autopilot shouldn't pick it up. I'm going to try this. Okay, so right now we're still on heading mode. It's far enough away from that radial that I just set in there that it isn't able to steer towards it. The autopilot can't see the course signal, so it has gone into Nav Arm mode, and it will stay in ARM mode until it gets close enough to that course signal that it can intercept it. Now I'm going to help it by turning the heading bug, get it more of a intercept on that course. And let's see how this works. I'm not sure, I may have turned it a little too much. I'm going to help it a little bit and bring it back somewhat. Bring it back to something like this. And now I'm going to turn the heading bug. Okay, so let's just say we want to intercept that. And you usually use about a 30-degree intercept angle. That's convention. No more than 45. But we should then begin to see, as we approach closer to intercepting this radial I just set in there, we should see the center section called the course deviation indicator, CDI, begin to move inward. But be watching now as we get closer. At some point, we're going to start to see, we'll see this navigation arm disappear, and the HDG will change to NAV. It'll just automatically switch. And then once it does, it will turn and follow the course, the radial, the course arrow. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. I had to change batteries on the camera. You may have seen a difference, and there may have been a slight difference in the camera angle on this, but the last thing I wanted to show you, and I'm going to unpause the simulator. Again, we're at 5,000. We're tracking a VOR radial on a nav mode. The last thing I'm going to do here is we're going to center heading bug, get on heading mode. Okay, we're applying the heading bug. I'm going to turn to a heading of 090 using the heading bug, maintaining 5,000. And I'm going to set up a course, GPS course, direct to, let's pick Livermore, KLVK. Now this applies whether you're using a G1000 or Grumman 430 for those of you flying standard gauge planes. But there you press the direct to button, direct to, and the simulator makes it a little easy. It gives you a keypad. I can put that in, but I'll use the knobs as we would in the G1000. So I'm going to hit the little knob to get the K. K. Oh no, where? Give me the K. I need my glasses for this, I think. Okay, K, big knob. Then we want L. L, okay, big knob over. Next space, and we want V. I'm going to go backwards for this. W, K, L, V. Can't read this. Here's K, L, V. Oh, that's V, W. One more. Okay, and then K. K. Here's Livermore. And then enter, enter, and enter. Okay, and now we've set up a GPS course direct to Livermore. But we don't see that yet because I haven't changed my CDI. This is still on VOR. So the one thing about this is, as long as we're on heading mode on the autopilot, we are free to change navigational sources and not create a problem. Here I want to go to there. But let's just say that, for example, well, I'll show you in a minute. I'm going to switch to CDI, I'm going to recenter this, direct enter, enter, so I don't have a problem with the navigation mode enter. So I'm going to go to nav mode, and now you see it's now turning to follow that GPS course. So it's very much the same idea as tracking a VOR radial. It will do the same thing. Now the nice thing about this is if you have a GPS flight plan set up where you have various segments, you have multiple waypoints and different segments of your flight plan, the autopilot will follow each of those segments. So when it gets to the new waypoint and the next segment of the flight plan goes in a different direction, the autopilot will automatically make that turn. So it's pretty much a hands-off arrangement. And let's just say I want to descend now to 4,500. So I reach down here. I'm going to dial in 4,500 on my knobs, the black knobs, making sure that the altitude has armed. I'm going to unlock by hitting the Alt button and pressing down, giving myself about a 400 feet per minute descent rate. I wouldn't recommend anything more than 700, maybe 800 feet. It's about as max as you want to go on descent with this G1000. And I'm going to bring my airspeed back, my power back, which translates directly to airspeed. Because again, the autopilot doesn't, there's two things the autopilot will not control, and that is the power setting, and it will not control your rudder. So if you're in a climb or a descent, it's possible that you might need to use some rudder in that climb, the right rudder, as we normally do in the 172. So here on this descent, really what I'm controlling with the throttle is the airspeed. I'm getting ready to intercept. Once I intercept that or capture that altitude, then I'm going to add the power back into where our normal cruise power is. And actually I'll do that before we get there so that there's a smooth transition and I don't lose any airspeed on the level out. Okay, there we go. And capture. And that's pretty much the function. Now, the last thing I'll leave you with is, right now we're on a nav mode for following the GPS course. If I press and center my heading bug, that allows me then to go on to heading mode and nothing changes. So always make a habit of centering the heading bug, or if you don't have a G1000, rotate your heading bug to the top before you engage the heading mode, and there the autopilot won't go, steering off in some crazy direction that you didn't plan on. Last thing I want to show you here though is if I switch from one nav source to the other, I'm going to go back to nav mode. Okay, here we go. If I go back to nav mode and I switch my CDI, watch what happens to the autopilot. It starts flashing. Okay, that's signaling to you that if you don't do something in the next few seconds, it's going to go off, because it will not. It doesn't like it when you change navigational source when you're already locked onto one and trying to change it with the other. Now this is behaving a little differently in the airplane. By this point, the autopilot will just turn right off. I mean, it'll just disable. Okay. Here it's just simply flashing. So I'm going to show you the correct way to do it. Let's go back onto our GPS. Press nav mode. Get back on that. If, for example, I wanted to mess around or change the CDI for whatever reason, I want to go on heading mode first. Oh, heading. Always make sure it says HDG. Then I'm free to change the course, the navigational source on the needle without impacting the autopilot. So I could, at some point, instead of, I could move from tracking GPS, now I could instead decide I want to go fly to that VOR, center that up, and then hit nav mode, and it will make that turn, and we're on our way. Okay, so hopefully that's given you just enough of an overview of this autopilot so that the next time you fly, you'll have some information on this. You can, but again, I'd emphasize, until you're more familiar with the autopilot, please don't think about turning on the autopilot until you're in reasonably level flight. Okay, and if you're in level flight, then you turn on the autopilot. Oh, now by pushing that, I just turned it off. You'll hear that. Now it's flashing for a minute. Now the autopilot's off. So if you're just getting started with this, be in reasonably level flight, turn on the autopilot, make sure your heading bug is centered, go on heading mode, and hit Alt. Okay, and that's the easiest way to just get established, get stabilized, and then from there you can decide if you want to climb or descend to a certain altitude, or if you want to go follow a GPS course or something. Later on, when you get more familiar with the autopilot, you'll be able to bypass some of those steps to get right to where you want. That's it. Have a good day.